Right now, underneath the thought you're consciously aware of, another one is quietly running the show. Older, steadier, and far more powerful than anything crossing your mind on purpose. And it already decided something about the next 10 years of your life, without ever asking for your permission. You've been told your thoughts are just noise, background chatter, something you can shrug off, joke about, and move past without a second look. That belief is the most expensive lie you were ever handed, because while you were busy dismissing it as harmless, that noise was quietly building the exact life you're standing in right now, one repetition at a time. I'm not talking about vague positivity, and I'm not talking about magic. I'm talking about something you can actually trace, cause to effect, thought to consequence. And before this video ends, I'm going to hand you the proof directly. Not a theory, not a quote on a poster. Something you'll recognize instantly once you finally see it. If you've made it this far, it's because you're determined to have a life of success. So I invite you to subscribe to the channel, because every video will help you develop the mindset that attracts wealth, prosperity, and new opportunities every day. Let me show you what I mean, because it's easier to see in someone else's life before you're willing to look for it in your own. A few months ago, I spent an afternoon with a man named Walter, a warehouse supervisor in his early 50s who'd applied for the same regional manager position 4 separate times over 11 years. Someone younger, someone with less experience on paper, got the job every time. He told the story almost cheerfully, the way people tell stories they've rehearsed enough that the sting has worn smooth. Bad timing, office politics, a boss who never liked him. All of it may have been true, in part. But somewhere in the second hour of talking, almost as an aside, he mentioned that before every one of those 4 interviews, he'd caught himself thinking the same private sentence, lying in bed the night before, staring at the ceiling. They're not going to pick someone like me for that. He said it so lightly he didn't notice what he'd just handed me. I asked him to say it again. He laughed, uncomfortable this time, and admitted some version of that sentence had shown up before every interview of his adult life, going back to a job he didn't get at 23. Here's the actual hinge of everything I want to walk you through tonight. Walter wasn't lying about the politics or the timing. What he'd never considered was simpler and far more uncomfortable, that a man who walks into a room already convinced he won't be chosen carries that conviction in with him, in ways too small to name and too consistent to be an accident. The hesitation before a hard question, the handshake that doesn't quite commit, the eye contact that looks away half a second too soon. Nothing dramatic enough for anyone, including Walter, to point to. All of it together forming an impression that confirmed, every time, the sentence he'd told himself the night before. This is more precise than positive thinking, a phrase so overused it's lost most of its meaning. Napoleon Hill spent a significant part of his working life studying what he called autosuggestion, the principle that the subconscious mind absorbs whatever thought is repeated with real feeling behind it, then quietly organizes behavior and attention around that thought, whether it's true or false, whether it serves you or ruins you. He was exact about one detail people who quote him casually tend to skip. The subconscious doesn't evaluate. It accepts what's fed to it, the way soil accepts whatever seed gets planted, indifferent to whether that seed feeds you or poisons you. Walter never sat down and decided to sabotage his own interviews. Nobody does that on purpose. What he did instead was rehearse the outcome he feared until his subconscious treated it as settled fact rather than fear at all, and a mind that has already settled a question stops working to solve it. As far as that part of him was concerned, the interview was already over the moment he closed his eyes the night before. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to hear this and assume I'm telling you Walter simply manifested his own rejection through bad vibes. That's not what I'm describing. I'm describing something with an actual mechanism, one you can trace step by step if you look closely. A thought repeated with real emotion doesn't stay contained in the privacy of your own head. It leaks into posture, into tone, into the fraction of a second decisions your face makes before your conscious mind catches up. Other people don't need to read your mind. They only need to watch your body do what your mind already rehearsed. There's research in behavioral psychology that circles this same territory from a different angle, and none of it is mystical. Studies on what's sometimes called behavioral confirmation have found that a person's private expectation about an interaction measurably shapes the small, unconscious signals they send during it. And the other person tends to respond in exactly the way that confirms the original expectation. Not because the universe arranges outcomes for or against you. Because you are, quietly, shaping the interaction itself before a word of it has happened, using nothing but a sentence you told yourself in the dark. Walter's sentence was 11 years old by the time I met him, rehearsed the night before every opportunity that mattered, each repetition adding weight, until it stopped feeling like a fear and started feeling like a fact he was simply reporting about himself. Here's what should genuinely unsettle you. If a single sentence, repeated enough times in private, can quietly shape something as concrete as who gets chosen for a job, what else has a sentence like that been shaping in your life without your knowledge, somewhere further from view, somewhere you'd never think to look first? Here's where it gets harder to write off as a fluke, because the next place this shows up isn't in a job interview at all. It's inside your own body, and it doesn't ask your permission either. I met a woman named Denise a couple of years ago, an accountant in her mid-40s, who spent almost 8 months convinced something was seriously wrong with her. It started small, a tired stretch after a hard quarter at work, the kind everyone has. But Denise had lost her father to an illness the doctors caught late. And somewhere in that grief, a private thought took root. I probably have it too, and nobody's caught it yet. She didn't say this out loud, not for months. She just thought it, quietly, most days, usually right before falling asleep and right after waking up. Two of the exact moments the mind is most suggestible, when the analytical, skeptical part of you is offline and the rest of you is simply listening. By month 3, Denise had headaches that hadn't existed in month 1. Real headaches. Her sleep had fractured into 2 and 3-hour stretches. Her digestion, which had never given her trouble in 40 years, started acting up in ways that sent her to 3 different specialists. Every test came back clean. Every doctor told her, with growing bewilderment, that there was nothing there. And every clean result somehow made the fear worse instead of better, because now, in her mind, it just meant whatever it was hadn't been found yet. I want to be exact about what happened here, because it would be easy to hear this and think Denise was imagining her symptoms, and that's not what I'm telling you. The headaches were real. The sleep loss was real. Her body wasn't performing an illness for an audience. It was responding, faithfully and literally, to 8 months of a single instruction repeated with genuine terror behind it. The same way a body responds to any prolonged threat, flooding itself with stress hormones, tightening the muscles at the base of the skull, disrupting the digestive system that only functions properly when the body believes it's safe enough to rest. None of that requires an actual illness to switch on. It only requires a mind convinced, deeply and repeatedly, that one is coming. Medicine has a name for this exact phenomenon, sitting on the far side of the coin from the placebo effect most people have at least heard of. It's called the nocebo effect, the documented, measurable capacity of a negative expectation, repeated and believed, to produce real physical symptoms with no external cause behind them at all. Researchers studying it have watched people develop genuine, recordable physiological changes from nothing more than what they expected to happen to their own bodies. Not imagination in the dismissive sense. A real biological response to a thought treated as fact. Napoleon Hill wrote about a version of this almost a century before the word nocebo entered common medical vocabulary, in the section of his work devoted to what he called the fear of ill health, one of the 6 basic fears he considered most destructive to the average person's life. He described how a mind saturated with the expectation of sickness could produce the actual physical symptoms of sickness, and how the habit of discussing imagined illness, turning it over in conversation and in private thought, tended to manufacture the very condition it feared most. He wasn't writing about people faking symptoms for attention. He was describing the same mechanism I just walked you through with Denise, decades before science had the language to measure it in a lab. What finally interrupted it for Denise wasn't a new test or a new doctor. It was a single blunt sentence from a nurse practitioner who'd run out of patience with the specialist merry-go-round and told her plainly that her body had been running on a threat response for the better part of a year, and that no scan was going to find a threat that had never been physical to begin with. Denise told me that sentence made her furious at first, because it sounded like she was being told the pain wasn't real. It took her weeks to understand it meant almost the opposite. The pain was entirely real, and it had a cause, just not the one she'd spent 8 months hunting for in the wrong direction entirely. I bring up Denise's body specifically because I think most people assume the damage a destructive thought does stays contained to mood, to motivation, to the parts of life that already feel a little abstract. It doesn't stay contained. It moves into muscle, into sleep, into the systems keeping you alive right now, whether or not you ever consciously notice it happening. And if a thought can reach that far into something as concrete as your own body, there's a much closer question worth asking, one most people never think to ask about themselves until it's already cost them something they can't easily get back. The closer question is this one, and it's harder to look at than the last two, because it doesn't involve a stranger interviewing you for a job or a body you can send off to get scanned. It involves the people who already love you. I spent an evening a while back with a man named Marcus, 39, recently out of his third serious relationship in 6 years. Each one had ended roughly the same way, not with a single dramatic betrayal, but with a slow, mutual exhaustion that Marcus described, every time, as them finally getting tired of me. He said the phrase so naturally, I almost let it slide past without comment. Then I asked him when he'd first started expecting that particular ending, and he went quiet for a moment before admitting it wasn't something that happened toward the end of those relationships at all. It was something he'd believed walking into every one of them, usually within the first few months, long before there was any real evidence either way. Marcus grew up watching his father leave twice, the second time for good, and somewhere in that childhood he'd formed a quiet, working theory about how love operates. People stay for a while, and then, eventually, they leave. Not a decision he made consciously. A conclusion a much younger version of him reached and then never revisited. The way you stop questioning a fact you learned early enough in life. Here's what that belief actually did to him, and it's worth being specific because it's more mechanical than tragic. Convinced on some level that abandonment was only a matter of time, Marcus developed a habit of testing it. Small provocations, minor withdrawals, moments of picking a fight over something insignificant, all of it functioning, whether he meant it to or not, as an early check for the exit he already expected to find. Most people, tested that way often enough, over enough years, eventually do leave, not because they stopped caring, but because being quietly, repeatedly auditioned for abandonment is exhausting in a way that's very hard to explain to the person doing it, and even harder to keep enduring indefinitely. Psychologists who study attachment and what's sometimes called rejection sensitivity have documented this exact loop in relationship after relationship. A person who expects to be left doesn't just wait passively for it to happen. They behave, often without any awareness of doing so, in ways that make the ending more likely. Reading neutral silence as coldness, treating an ordinary bad mood as evidence, withdrawing first to soften a blow they've already decided is coming. The belief doesn't sit quietly in the background waiting to be proven true or false by events outside its control. It reaches out and starts arranging those events itself. Napoleon Hill wrote about something adjacent to this when he described the fear of loss of love, one of the 6 basic fears he considered corrosive enough to quietly wreck an otherwise capable life. He noted how this particular fear tends to produce jealousy, suspicion, and a kind of preemptive possessiveness that damages the very relationships it's trying to protect. A person, terrified of losing something, often behaves in ways that make the loss more likely, not less. He wasn't describing weakness. He was describing a thought so deeply rehearsed it started directing behavior on its own. Exactly the way Walter's sentence directed a handshake. Exactly the way Denise's fear directed her own nervous system. Marcus didn't choose to sabotage 3 relationships. Nobody sits down and decides that on purpose. What he did, quietly and consistently, for 19 years, was rehearse a single conclusion about how love ends until it stopped feeling like a fear and started feeling like a law of nature he was simply obeying. The same transformation you've now watched happen 3 separate times tonight, in 3 completely different corners of a life. A job, a body, a marriage. 1 mechanism, 3 disguises. I want you to notice something before the next part of this video, because I think it matters more than it sounds like it should. If you've recognized even a piece of yourself in Walter, or in Denise, or in Marcus, that recognition is the first moment this stops being information about someone else and starts being something you're actually capable of doing something about. If you're ready to stop being a passenger to a sentence you never consciously chose and start deciding, on purpose, what you're going to believe about yourself instead, type "I believe" in the comments right now. Not as a slogan, as the first repetition of a different instruction, chosen deliberately, in front of other people, instead of the one that's been running quietly in the background without your consent. I read every one, and the version of you who writes that today has already interrupted something the version who scrolls past it is still, right now, rehearsing. Here's a question worth sitting with before I show you exactly how far this actually reaches. Where did the sentence come from in the first place? Walter didn't invent his sentence out of nowhere at 23. Denise didn't manufacture 8 months of fear from thin air. Marcus didn't dream up a theory about how love ends without a reason. In every case, when I pushed past the sentence itself and asked where it had first taken root, the answer traced back to something almost absurdly small, a single moment, usually years earlier, usually delivered by someone who never gave it a second thought afterward. A teacher who told Walter, in front of the whole class at 14, that he wasn't really leadership material. A relative of Denise's who spent every holiday dinner narrating some new symptom in exhausting detail, teaching her, without meaning to, that the body was something to be suspicious of. Marcus's own father, walking out the door twice, never once explaining that it had nothing to do with whether his son deserved to be stayed for. None of those moments were dramatic enough, on their own, to explain what came afterward. A comment, a pattern glimpsed at the dinner table, an offhand remark from an adult who forgot they'd ever said it by the following week. That's the part almost nobody accounts for when they think about how a destructive thought takes hold. It rarely arrives as an event. It arrives as a seed, and seeds don't do much of anything the day they're planted. What they do is compound. That word matters more than it might sound like it should, especially to you, watching a channel built around understanding wealth. You already know, intuitively, what compound interest does to a small sum of money left alone for 20 years, how a modest, almost unremarkable starting number can quietly become something enormous, not because anything dramatic happened to it, but because it was left running, uninterrupted, for long enough. A thought works on the exact same principle, except most people never think to apply it in that direction. A single sentence, repeated with real feeling a few times a week, for 20 or 30 years, isn't a small thing by the time you finally notice it. It's the compounded result of thousands of repetitions, each one reinforcing the last, each one making the next repetition a little more automatic, a little more believable, a little harder to interrupt without real, deliberate effort. This is precisely what Napoleon Hill meant when he warned that the subconscious mind doesn't care whether the thought being repeatedly deposited into it is one you chose on purpose or one you absorbed by accident from a careless comment at 14. Interest compounds on both kinds of deposits equally. Nobody sends you a statement showing the balance. You only find out what's accumulated when you watch yourself hesitate at an interview, or feel a symptom with no cause, or push away the person who loves you, and you finally ask, seriously, for the first time, why? I've shown you 3 people tonight, in 3 different corners of an ordinary life, and I could show you 50 more, because once you know what you're looking for, this pattern is almost impossible to unsee. But I promised you proof at the start of this video, not anecdotes about people you'll never meet, and there's a difference between the two that I think matters enormously. Anecdotes can always be waved away as coincidence, one story among billions, meaning whatever you want it to mean. What I'm about to show you next isn't that. It's a documented case involving a real family, where the exact mechanism I've spent the last several minutes describing was pushed to its absolute extreme, deliberately, on purpose, against a diagnosis doctors were completely certain about, by a man who happened to be the same person who first wrote down almost everything I've told you tonight. Here it is, exactly as it happened, because nothing I could invent would land with the same weight as what's actually documented. Napoleon Hill's second son was born without ears. Not partial hearing loss, not a treatable defect. The boy came into the world with no external ear structure at all, and the doctors who examined him told his father, plainly and with full medical confidence, that the child would almost certainly never hear a sound for the rest of his life, and likely, as a direct consequence, would never learn to speak either. A child who cannot hear language has no model to learn it from. The prognosis wasn't cruelty. It was simply what the medicine of the time understood to be true, delivered to a father in the first days of his son's life. Hill refused to accept it as final, and I want to be precise about what that refusal actually looked like in practice, because it wasn't denial. He didn't pretend the diagnosis away or tell people his son could hear when he couldn't. What he did instead was make a deliberate, specific decision that most parents in his position never think to make at all. He decided that his son would grow up believing he could find a way to hear, rather than growing up believing he was broken, and he set out, on purpose, to plant that expectation into the boy's mind from infancy, before the child was old enough to have absorbed any other verdict about himself. He refused to allow pity into the house. He refused to let the boy be spoken about, in his own presence, as someone missing something essential. Instead, from the earliest days he could manage it, Hill spoke to his son constantly, closely, deliberately, treating him as a child who was going to hear rather than one who couldn't. Not as false comfort, but as the same principle he'd spent years studying in the successful men and women he interviewed for his work. A thought, held with enough conviction and repeated with enough emotional intensity, doesn't stay a private hope. It starts organizing behavior, effort, and, he believed, and was willing to test on the person he loved most in the world, even physical capacity itself. This is the exact mechanism I've been describing to you through Walter, through Denise, through Marcus, except run in the opposite direction, by a man with everything to lose if he was wrong, and no guarantee whatsoever that conviction alone could move a body past what medicine had already declared impossible. Every negative sentence I've shown you tonight worked by quiet repetition, absorbed accidentally, aimed at nobody in particular. Hill aimed the same faculty on purpose, with total intention, at a single outcome, for years, without once letting the people around his son plant the opposite instruction instead. And something began to happen that the original diagnosis had no room for. Within a few years, in ways that unsettled the specialists who delivered that first prognosis, the boy began to respond to sound. Not perfectly, not in the way a child born with ears responds, but measurably, unmistakably, in a case medical literature had already closed the book on. I'm not going to tell you the rest of it yet, because I want you to sit with this part first, the same way I sat with it the first time I read the full account. A father was told, by people with every credential to be believed, that a specific outcome was medically impossible. He decided, on the strength of a principle he'd spent his career documenting in other people's lives, to apply it to his own son instead. In reality, however partially, however gradually, began moving in a direction the doctors had ruled out entirely. I'll tell you exactly what that boy became later in this video, because it matters more than you'd expect, and I don't want to rush past it. For now, I want you to hold both halves of what you've just heard side by side. A private sentence, repeated without intention, cost Walter a promotion, cost Denise 8 months of her body turning against itself, cost Marcus 3 relationships he genuinely wanted to keep. And a private sentence, repeated with total intention, moved a father's son past a diagnosis specialists were certain about. Same mechanism, same mind. The only variable that changed was which direction it was pointed. I want to bring this back to you now, because it would be easy to watch Walter, Denise, Marcus, and even Hill's own son, and quietly file all 4 away as other people's stories. Remarkable, maybe moving, but happening somewhere outside the actual hours of your own week. That would be the most comfortable way to watch this video. It would also be the most expensive. So let me ask you something directly, and I want you to actually answer it. Not just let the question pass by the way questions in videos usually do. What's the sentence? The one about money that comes out easily when a bill arrives you weren't expecting. The one about your body that surfaces the moment you feel unusually tired. The one about how people eventually treat you once they really get to know you. You have one. Almost everyone does, and most people have never said it out loud even once, because it doesn't feel like a belief. It feels like a fact you're simply reporting, the same way you'd report the weather outside your window. Here's what makes this genuinely difficult to catch on your own, and I think it's the real reason so many people go their entire lives without ever examining it. The most dangerous version of this sentence was never the dramatic one. It isn't, "I am worthless," or "I will always fail." Lines so extreme they'd trigger your own internal alarm the moment you heard yourself think them. The dangerous version sounds reasonable. It sounds like self-knowledge. "I've just never been good with money." That's not really how things work out for people like me. I'm not the kind of person who gets picked. Said calmly. Said with a small, knowing smile sometimes. The kind that signals maturity rather than fear. A sentence that sounds like wisdom is far more dangerous than one that sounds like despair, because wisdom doesn't get questioned. It gets repeated. Think of it the way water works on stone, because that's closer to the actual mechanism than anything more dramatic. A single drop of water striking the same spot on a rock does nothing you could measure. Come back in 20 years and you'll find a groove, sometimes a channel deep enough to redirect where the water goes entirely, all without a single dramatic strike. Just the same unremarkable drop, landing in the same unremarkable place, thousands and thousands of times. That's what your recurring sentence has been doing to the actual shape of your decisions, your posture in hard conversations, the opportunities you notice versus the ones that pass you by unseen. Not one dramatic collapse. One ordinary thought, landing in the same place, for years. Most of what runs through your mind on any given day isn't new. It's rerun. The same handful of conclusions about money, about your body, about whether people stay, replaying with the exact same certainty they had the first 100 times, simply because a thought that's already worn a groove takes far less effort to think again than a new one takes to form. Your own mind, without malice, without any intention to harm you, is doing exactly what minds are built to do. Following the path of least resistance, which happens to be the deepest groove already sitting there, however it originally got carved. This is why willpower alone so rarely fixes it. And I think that failure is exactly what convinces so many people this can't be changed at all. Trying to think a single positive thought once, in the middle of an otherwise unchanged week, is like dropping one bucket of sand into a groove 20 years deep and expecting the river to change course by morning. It won't, and the disappointment that follows usually gets misread as proof that change is impossible, rather than what it actually is. Proof that a groove built slowly can only be redirected the same way it was built. Not with one dramatic gesture. With enough deliberate repetitions in a new direction for long enough that the water starts, gradually, wearing a different path. I know that's not the instant fix most people are hoping for when they click on a video like this one. I'd rather tell you the truth than something easier to swallow. But there's something underneath that truth that I think you haven't fully considered yet. And it's the reason I'm not telling you this story to make you feel worse about the groove you're standing in right now. Here's what I imagine some of you are thinking right now, and I want to meet it directly instead of talking past it. Isn't this just another way of blaming people for things that genuinely aren't their fault? What about real depression, real anxiety, conditions with an actual biological basis that don't dissolve because someone decided to think a nicer sentence about themselves? What about the layoff that had nothing to do with performance, the diagnosis that arrived with no warning, the family a person was simply born into, with none of the resources another family down the street happened to have? I want to answer that as honestly as I can, because you deserve honesty far more than you deserve a tidy conclusion that makes this video sound cleaner than the truth actually is. Everything in that list is real. I'm not standing here telling you a sentence you repeat to yourself is more powerful than clinical depression. And if you're dealing with something at that level, what you need is a professional who can actually treat it, not a video. And reaching out for that kind of help is not a failure of mindset. It's the same category of decision as calling a doctor about a broken bone instead of trying to think your way past it. Nothing I've told you tonight replaces that. Nothing in Hill's work claims to either. Whatever the watered-down version of his ideas has been turned into by people who never read past the first chapter. Here's the distinction I actually want you to walk away with, and it's narrower than just think positive, which is exactly why it survives contact with real hardship instead of collapsing the moment life gets difficult. There's a difference between the sentence that explains what happened to you and the sentence that predicts what happens to you next, and most people, without ever noticing the swap, let the first one quietly turn into the second. The layoff is a fact. I'm the kind of person companies get rid of is a prediction, dressed up as a conclusion, and it's the prediction, not the layoff, that goes on to shape the next 10 job applications. The diagnosis is a fact. My body is against me is a prediction, and it's the prediction, repeated in the dark before every appointment, that keeps a nervous system locked in the exact threat state we talked about with Denise. The unfair childhood is a fact. This is just how love works for people like me, is a prediction Marcus carried into rooms that had nothing to do with his father. None of the 3 sentences I just gave you are lies exactly. They're explanations that quietly overreached, stretching a single true fact about the past into a permanent verdict about the future, without anyone ever pausing to check whether the second half was actually justified by the first. That overreach is the entire target of everything I've shown you tonight. Not the hardship. The sentence that turned one hardship into a life sentence. I think about the difference between Walter and a version of Walter who might have handled the exact same 4 rejections differently. Not by pretending they didn't sting, not by performing optimism he didn't feel, but by keeping the fact and refusing the prediction. That job didn't work out. Full stop, no attached forecast about every job after it. That's a much smaller, much less dramatic sounding shift than most people expect the fix to be, and I think that's exactly why so few people ever make it. It doesn't look like transformation while it's happening. It looks like nothing at all, just one sentence, quietly, refusing to grow a second half it was never actually owed. I've been talking to you for a while now, as if I discovered all of this from the outside, watching Walter and Denise and Marcus from a safe, clinical distance. That's not entirely honest, And I think it's time I told you my own version of it, because it would be strange to ask you to look this closely at yourself while keeping my own groove hidden from view. For almost 6 years before this channel existed, I had a specific, quiet sentence about putting my own voice out into the world, and it went something like this. People don't really listen to someone like me. Not dramatic, not a crisis, just a small, reasonable-sounding conclusion that showed up every single time I got close to actually publishing anything. A folder full of half-written scripts, ideas I'd talk about at dinner with real enthusiasm, and then quietly never touch again. Ready in every sense except the one that mattered. I told myself, for years, that I was waiting for the material to be good enough, for the timing to be right, for some version of confidence I assumed other people had simply been issued and I hadn't. It took an uncomfortably long time to notice that "not yet" had become the actual plan, repeated so often it had stopped feeling like avoidance and started feeling like patience. I was, in every sense that mattered, doing to my own career exactly what Walter had been doing to his interviews for 11 years, except I didn't have the excuse of a sentence I'd absorbed at 14 from someone else. I'd built mine myself, quietly, one unpublished draft at a time. The night I finally recorded the first version of a video I never ended up releasing, I remember sitting with the cursor over the upload button for close to 40 minutes. Doing absolutely nothing else, just staring at it. Every version of the sentence showed up in that 40 minutes, dressed in slightly different clothes each time. Nobody's going to watch this. You're going to put yourself out there and confirm what you already suspect. Wait until it's better. There will always be a version of better available to hide behind. And some part of me knew that even in the moment, and uploaded nothing anyway. What actually got me to publish, eventually, wasn't a sudden collapse of the fear, because the fear was still fully there, sitting in my chest exactly where it had been for 6 years. What changed was smaller and much less cinematic than I wish I could tell you. I asked myself a version of the same question I'd later end up asking Walter without realizing the parallel yet. Was I going to keep treating "people don't listen to someone like me" as a fact I was reporting? Or was I finally going to treat it as the untested prediction it had always actually been? I didn't feel brave typing that first title. I felt exactly the way I imagine Walter felt walking into interview number 5, if he'd ever gotten the chance to walk into one differently. The video did fine. Not remarkable, not viral, nothing that would make a satisfying story on its own. What mattered wasn't the number attached to it. What mattered was that the sentence had finally been tested instead of simply believed, for the first time in 6 years, and it hadn't held up the way it had insisted it would. That's the part one want you to sit with, more than any number. The groove didn't disappear the first time I sent water down a different path. It's still there, honestly, some weeks more than others. But it stopped being the only path available, and that's a different thing entirely from it never having existed at all. If any part of what I've just told you sounds like your own folder of half-finished drafts, your own cursor hovering over your own version of an upload button, I'm not going to tell you the fear disappears the moment you decide to test the sentence instead of obeying it. It doesn't. What I can tell you is exactly what starts to change once you do, and precisely how to begin, tonight, with whatever sentence just surfaced while you were listening to mine. Start here, because it costs you nothing except a moment of honesty you've probably been avoiding. Catch the sentence. Not analyze it. Not journal about it for an hour. Just catch it. Out loud if you can manage it. The next time it slips past you the way it slipped past Walter without him noticing for 11 years. You'll know it when you hear it, because it will sound reasonable, calm, almost like wisdom. That calm is exactly what's made it invisible for this long. Once you've caught it, do the second thing, the one we walked through a few minutes ago. Separate the fact from the prediction hiding inside it. If the sentence is, "I'm not good with money," ask yourself, honestly, what actually happened, stripped down to the bare event with no forecast attached. Maybe the honest fact is smaller than the sentence. One bad year, one bad decision at 22, One habit you never actually corrected because you were too busy believing the larger verdict instead of examining the specific behavior underneath it. The fact usually shrinks the moment you isolate it from the prediction riding on its back. Third, choose your suggestible windows on purpose. The same two Denise's fear had been quietly occupying for 8 months without her permission. The minutes right before sleep, and the minutes right after waking, when the analytical, skeptical part of your mind hasn't fully come online yet. This is exactly the terrain Hill pointed to when he described feeding the subconscious deliberately rather than letting it absorb whatever happened to be lying around. Pick one sentence, specific and believable, not a grand rewrite of your entire identity overnight, and say it in those windows with real feeling behind it, the same intensity the old sentence had when it first took hold. A flat, mechanical repetition won't do much. The emotion is the part that actually moves the needle. Fourth, if any version of Marcus's pattern is familiar to you, testing the people who love you, withdrawing first to soften a blow you've already decided is coming. The discipline here is narrower and harder than the others, because it asks you to sit still inside uncertainty instead of resolving it prematurely with a provocation. The next time you feel the urge to test whether someone's really going to stay, notice the urge, name it privately for what it is, and choose not to act on it, just once. You don't have to trust perfectly. You only have to interrupt the behavior that's been manufacturing the very outcome you're afraid of. And fifth, give this actual time, because I'd be lying to you if I promised a groove 20 years deep gets redirected in a week, and I told you earlier that you deserve honesty more than a tidy ending. Compound interest works the same way in both directions. It didn't build the sentence overnight, and it won't dismantle it overnight either. What it will do, reliably, if you keep making the deliberate deposit instead of the automatic one, is compound in the new direction exactly the way it compounded in the old one. Slowly, invisibly, for longer than feels fair, until one day you notice a decision you made without the old sentence even showing up to weigh in. None of these 5 things will feel dramatic while you're doing them, and I think that's exactly why so few people commit to them for long enough to matter. There was no visible moment where Walter's sentence became true, and there won't be one dramatic moment where a new sentence proves itself either. But there's a version of this story I haven't finished telling you yet, and I think you're ready now to hear exactly how far one deliberately repeated thought actually went, in the hands of a father who refused to let a doctor's certainty become his son's permanent sentence. I told you about the diagnosis, and I told you the specialists were unsettled by what happened in those first few years. I never told you what that boy actually grew into, because I wanted the diagnosis to sit with you fully first, without the outcome softening it too early. Now I think you're ready for the rest of it. The boy never developed ears in the anatomical sense doctors would call normal. That part of the original prognosis never fully reversed, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise, because the honest version of this story is more useful to you than a tidier one would be. What changed instead was everything downstream of it. As he grew, with a hearing aid device fitted to compensate for what his body genuinely couldn't do on its own, he developed the capacity to hear well enough to attend an ordinary school, alongside hearing children, in a system that had no separate track prepared for a boy the medical literature had already written off as functionally deaf and likely mute. He learned language. He learned to speak clearly enough that strangers meeting him for the first time often had no idea anything had ever been declared impossible about him at all. He went on to finish his education entirely within the ordinary system, at a pace indistinguishable from his hearing peers, and as an adult, he chose a career that still strikes me as almost too fitting to be real, except that it is. He went into the hearing aid industry himself, spending years helping other people, many of them children exactly like he had once been, gain access to sound the same way he had, not as an inspirational gesture, as an actual career, built on genuine expertise, serving people who'd been handed the same closed door he'd once been handed at birth. Hill referred back to his son's case for the rest of his working life as the clearest proof he had of everything he'd spent his career documenting in other people's fortunes. That a thought, held with total conviction and fed deliberately rather than left to chance, doesn't stay contained to mood or motivation. It reaches into what a body is actually capable of, further than caution would ever predict, further than a room full of qualified specialists were willing to predict either. He wasn't claiming belief alone had regrown missing anatomy. He was pointing at something narrower and, in its own way, more useful to you tonight, that the direction of a parent's conviction, repeated for years without wavering, had shaped every downstream outcome that conviction could actually reach. How the boy saw himself, how hard he worked to compensate for what medicine couldn't fix, what kind of life he built once the ceiling everyone else had assumed was fixed turned out, in practice, to have some genuine room above it. I think about the space between those two facts more than almost anything else in this story. The ears never came. The life the doctors ruled out entirely did. Both things are true at once, and I think the second one only happened because a single conviction, planted early and repeated relentlessly for years, refused to accept the first one as the end of the sentence. That's the same space you've been standing in this whole video, whether you've named it yet or not. Some facts about your life won't change no matter how deliberately you think about them. The childhood you had, the years already spent, the diagnosis or the layoff or the ending that's already happened and isn't available to be undone. What Hill's son proves, as directly as anything I could show you, is that the fact isn't where the story has to end. What grows in the space downstream of it, the life built around what can't be undone, answers to something you actually have access to, starting with whichever sentence you've been repeating about it. Tonight, in this exact hour, whether you've been choosing that sentence on purpose or simply inheriting it from a version of yourself who never thought to question where it came from. At the start of this video, I told you something was running underneath the thought you're consciously aware of right now, and that it had already decided things about your future without asking your permission. I didn't tell you what that something actually was, because I wanted you to recognize it yourself somewhere in the last several minutes, in your own voice, rather than have me hand it to you like a diagnosis. Maybe you found it in a version of Walter's sentence, the one you say to yourself the night before something that matters. Maybe it showed up closer to Denise's territory, in the way your body responds to a fear you've never said out loud. Maybe it looked more like Marcus, testing the people closest to you before they get the chance to leave first. However it found you tonight, I think you already know which one it was, and I don't need to say it out loud for both of us to know that you heard it. A sentence, repeated without your permission, shaped a career, a body, a marriage, quietly, over years, without ever announcing itself as the cause. And a sentence, repeated on purpose, by a father who refused to accept a closed diagnosis as a closed sentence, shaped a life doctors had already ruled out entirely. That's the proof I promised you at the beginning. Not a metaphor, not a poster. The same mechanism, working in both directions, in ordinary people and in one extraordinary case, indifferent the entire time to which direction you happen to be pointing it. I'm not going to tell you the fear disappears once you know this. It didn't for me, and I doubt it will for you either. What I can tell you is that a thought stops being able to run your life in secret the moment you finally catch it saying its name out loud. Everything after that is slower than anyone wants it to be, and realer than anything a slogan could give you. A groove doesn't reverse itself because you noticed it. It reverses because you kept sending the water somewhere else, on the ordinary nights when nobody was measuring the difference, for longer than felt fair. Somewhere in your life right now, there's a version of that closed diagnosis, a sentence a doctor, a parent, a failed year, or simply time itself handed you once, and that you've been quietly obeying ever since without ever checking whether it was still true, or whether it was ever entirely true to begin with. I don't know your exact version of it. I only know, after everything I've shown you tonight, that almost everyone carries one, mostly unnamed, mostly unquestioned, running in the background of decisions that look, from the outside, like simple caution. You're not broken for having one. Walter didn't have one. Denise didn't have one. Marcus didn't have one. Even the boy born without ears had one, delivered by people with every credential in the world to be believed. What separated what came after wasn't the absence of a hard sentence. It was who ended up holding the pen. I think about that distinction more than almost anything else in this story, not because it resolves neatly, but because it doesn't need to. Nobody gets handed a life free of sentences they didn't choose. What varies, quietly, decade after decade, is who stays the one writing the next line, and who hands the pen away without ever noticing the exchange had even taken place. Their name now, some of them, the ones that surfaced while you were listening. What you do with that is the only part of this story I can't write for you. Somewhere tonight, in the quiet minutes before you fall asleep, the exact window your own mind is most willing to listen without arguing back, there's a sentence waiting to be repeated one more time. It's already going to happen whether you decide anything about it or not. The only real question left is which one you're going to let it be. If tonight was the night one of your own sentences finally got a name, follow the channel before you close this, because there's more of this waiting for the nights you need it again. And if you know 5 people quietly repeating a version of the same sentence without realizing it, send this to them. You might be the reason one of them finally catches it.